Welcome to the AgEmerge podcast, brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. Your farming challenges are unique, so your practices should be too. We're here to share emerging ideas, build connections, and provoke conversation.
Get ready to improve your soil, your crops, your livestock, and your family's livelihood. I'm your producer, Kim Chase.
And I'm your host, Monty Bottens. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Today, we welcome Dr. Stephanie Seneff, a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On this podcast, Monty and Dr. Seneff discuss her research and work in understanding the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease. Monty, tell us a little bit more about this conversation.
Thank you, Kim. Today, you're going to really enjoy listening to Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She's an amazing critical thinker that is way ahead of her time. And she comes from outside the agricultural community and outside of the medical community. And it has given her an opportunity to see things from a totally different perspective. And I think that's important, to be listening to people who can see things that maybe we can't see when we're right in the middle of things. She's going to challenge your paradigm. I guarantee it. And that's okay. Be ready to be challenged. Be open to new ideas. I want you to listen, learn, and ask yourself, what if? What if some of these things that she's studied and discovered are correct? And if they are true, then what do you need to do as a result of it? So please tune in, listen up, and enjoy a conversation here with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Welcome to this episode of the AgEmerge podcast. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Seneff here today with us. She has a wealth of information and practical knowledge that she has assembled over the years and everything that she's done. And I'm just really glad she could join us today and share her perspectives on that infinite connection between agriculture and human health. Welcome, Stephanie.
So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, for those on the podcast that may not know you, I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell us your story.
Okay, well, so I'm at MIT, born and bred. I went to MIT undergraduate, graduate, PhD, worked for MIT my whole adult life. So I'm very attached to MIT. Most of my work was in computer science, developing precursors to Amazon Echo and iPhone, Siri iPhone, conversational interactions with the computer. But it was around 2007, 2008 timeframe that I got worried about autism. I saw the rates going up and I thought there's got to be something in the environment that's causing this continual increase in autism every year. People kept saying we're just diagnosing it more, and I didn't believe that. And so that took me on a mission of looking through all kinds of toxic chemicals, trying to figure out what it might be. And not until 2012 did I figure out glyphosate. And I really think glyphosate's a major player. It's not the only thing that causes autism, but it's a major player in the autism epidemic. And glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, pervasive in the food supply because it's so heavily used in agriculture. And this needs to stop. Things need to change. We need to go back to certified organic. The old style agriculture where you don't use chemicals is an essential change that we need to make in a hurry for the long-term health of our population.
Okay, so that's an interesting path that you've been on there. Tell me about that. How did you make the jump from, like you said, voice recognition interaction with computers? So there's hardware components and software components there, to autism. I'm sure there's a connection there.
It's hard to see. I mean, it's really just that I was lucky that I was being funded by a company in Taiwan. It's a computer company in Taiwan. And they were interested in sort of medicine and disease and connected to technology. So there was an opportunity for me to kind of shift my focus towards medical applications or health applications. So I was actually developing language games to help people learn a second language by playing games. In fact, for Americans learning Chinese, and they were funding me for that for many years. And I just one year I said, okay, guys, I'm going to do this. And I proposed, looking at environmental toxicity and looking at disease and looking for correlations between trying to figure out which chemicals in the environment might be causal in various diseases that were clearly going up. in a society, and they bought that. They said, that sounds great. So that I just switched over to that, and they have continued to fund me to this day. So I'm very, very fortunate in that respect.
Yeah, that is amazing. So really it led, the communication style led to the interest in the autism, but then you're like, well, wait a minute. Why do we have autism in the first place, right? Or what is causing these exponential increases in the disease? So kind of interesting. I always find that innovation, comes at the edge or at the fringe, or comes from people outside of
Right.
Of the issue, because they can see it from a different perspective.
I think that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for all the diseases, I feel like there's a core component of people who have been in that space for a long, long time, and they've got their own sort of central focus there, but it's not really correct. There's much more going on outside that other people who aren't sort of embedded in that system are able to see a larger picture and pick up on something else that may be very important, that these people have, all of them collectively have missed, because they're all they focus in on the same thing and they copy each other. It's really quite interesting how research goes that way.
So it's almost a groupthink phenomenon, when there's a lack of outside information. So I suppose for those people who have spent their entire career in there, you can ruffle some feathers.
I think so. Absolutely. Yes.
So there's that quote, truth passes through three phases, right? First, it's
right. I love that.
Secondly, it's actively disputed or violently disputed. And then third, it's accepted as truth, right?
Right. Yes, that's so true. It's
you're in the middle of number 2 right now, aren't you?
I think so.
Well, we thank you for being there. So now just, for farmers that are listening to this, right? We want to talk to them. There's a reason why I'm a farmer myself. There's a reason why we started to use glyphosate, right?
Absolutely.
We were told it was safe.
Right.
So compared to other chemistries out there, it's not acutely toxic. Okay. So I know cotton farmers have told me that if they touch timic, they can taste it on their tongue almost instantly. Okay, that's an insecticide.
That's really
it's
impressive.
like an instant toxicity, right? Or
yes.
you want to take a bath in gramoxone, that has bad consequences. But when people started using glyphosate, there's not really an immediate toxicity like that. So I think that's part of the safeness. Plus, we were told it was safer too from the companies that are marketing it.
Right.
So, but now, 30, 40 years later, we're learning some different things, aren't we? Why has it taken so long to learn that? And were we sold a bill of goods or lied to, or was it just ignorance is bliss?
Yeah, that's excellent questions. And I think we were lied to. I think the people that did the research for Monsanto back in the 70s understood there was something fishy going on here. And of course, they were eager to get it past the approval process. And so they kind of hid it under the rug. There's papers that Anthony Samsel has collaborated with me on a number of papers, and he's managed to get the government to hand over to him a huge number of documents that were in Monsanto documents that were not published, but they were prepared in the studies that went on to try to get glyphosate approved. And Anthony has found very damning evidence in those documents of Monsanto's knowledge that it accumulates, in the bone marrow, for example. It accumulates in the tissues. They sort of they claim that it just goes straight through. Most of it leaves, through the urine, through the feces, but there's a percentage that persists, and it persists everywhere in the body. And it accumulates. And that's what's really, really damaging, because you get more and more exposure. As the longer you live, the more exposure you get, the more the accumulation builds up, and things start to break. And it's a really, really fascinating chemical. I believe its mechanism of toxicity is totally unique, unique to glyphosate, and insidious and cumulative. And that's what's caused us to have a hard time seeing it, because when you do short-term studies, you don't necessarily see harm. It takes a long time for the harm to appear. And it's hard for you to believe that one chemical could cause so many diseases. You look at all these diseases that are going up dramatically. I started with autism, but when we started looking at glyphosate and what else is going up, we were shocked to find diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, various cancers like pancreatic cancer and thyroid cancer, all these things. And of course, gut problems, right? Inflammation of the gut, celiac disease. There's a huge list of diseases that are going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. The correlations are stunning. And we have not been able to find another chemical that matches as well as glyphosate does to these alarming increases in these conditions. You look at America, you know, we've got tons of diabetes and obesity. We're seeing obesity in the children. Something is going on. It's an endocrine disruption that's causing the person to gain weight. It's not that they're just a fat slob that doesn't, you know, want to exercise. We sort of blame ourselves that we're, you know, that we're just not controlling our appetite, or we're not exercising enough. You know, maybe there's something to that in terms of playing video games instead of running around outside. But I think the really big thing is a metabolic disorder that's caused by glyphosate, and probably other chemicals also affect metabolism. But glyphosate, every time a country starts adopting a Western diet, they start getting fat. I've been tracking it around the world.
We're taking a short break to share that the AgEmerge podcast is brought to you by the team at Ag Solutions Network. Rooted in innovation, ASN is committed to leaving the land better than we found it, not simply maintaining it. We're here to help you navigate the balancing act of productivity and building a legacy. From practices to products, ASN is more than a new jug. It's a new way of thinking. So don't be afraid to be different. Be afraid to be the same. Contact Ag Solutions Network today at asn.farm. And now back to our show.
So the people that would detract from this would say, okay, correlation versus causation, right? So
absolutely,
you can overlay all the graphs, and I've seen the detractors say that, oh well, it's just that it happens to be a coincidence of the timing, not necessarily the causing. So what are some things that we can know that this is a causal agent, not just correlated with maybe something else? And I'm just going to grab some things out of the thin air. You know, people have related climate change to these kind of things. People
right.
related,
yeah.
I don't know, obesity maybe to some of these things. What are or water quality? How can we know definitively that there is some correlation evidence there?
Well, the thing is to get to the underlying causal effects and to explain the biology. And that's what I do in my book. I have this book, Toxic Legacy, that was published last July by Chelsea Green.
Yep.
How the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment. And in that book, I explained the toxic mechanism that glyphosate uses to cause problems. And that is to say that I believe this is true. It's still a controversial topic, of course, whether this is true or not, but the evidence is quite strong, even from Monsanto's own studies. And I talk about that in the book. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. Glycine is the smallest amino acid. The amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And glyphosate is a glycine molecule, a complete glycine molecule, except that it's got an attachment to its nitrogen atom. And that attachment is called a methylphosphonate. So a little bit of chemistry there, methylphosphonate unit attached to the nitrogen, which changes its behavior a lot. It's much bulkier, it's negatively charged. You know, it has a very different behavior from glycine, but it still fits in the same socket that glycine fits in, to fit so as to be incorporated into a protein by mistake. So what happens is when the protein's being assembled, it's looking for glycine. It's got the code looking for glycine. It finds glyphosate, sticks it in there, goes on, and now you've got a glyphosate molecule inside the protein. And when that happens to certain proteins at certain places, it has devastating effects. So that's really, really interesting biochemistry. And you can rummage through the literature and find various proteins that have essential glycines at places where they could be substituted by glyphosate. And you can see that if those glycines are replaced by something else, the protein's broken. It's completely broken. So you can find the proteins that it would affect. And then you can go and see if it does affect those proteins by looking at the research literature on glyphosate's effects. And there's various papers that show that glyphosate suppresses this protein or that protein. And those proteins match with my prediction of where the glyphosate would have an effect. So it's quite an interesting kind of puzzle to piece together to get the story. But in the end, and then you can say, well, here's autism. And then what is it that causes autism? And then does glyphosate affect those particular enzymes that are known to be associated with autism, with genetic mutations? So you can really link a lot of things up, which I've done. And it's quite fascinating to be able to explain all of these conditions through that process.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating way on the amino acid side of things. And like you said, now we're building incomplete proteins, or we're building weak or damaged proteins, or we're not building proteins in the right ratio with each other for various metabolic activities. Plus, the other issue with glyphosate is just, what Dr. Huber's talked about a lot is the mineral chelation.
True, absolutely.
And autism and those kind of things where, it has such an affinity for copper. Or manganese, zinc,
right.
Even magnesium, any divalent cation, it really has an affinity for. So we're tying those things up. So, I think maybe a better way to frame this is, rather than not believe new information, is I think as farmers, or as other folks that are listening to this podcast, we need to think, what if this is true? Okay, let's accept it as innocent until proven guilty, right? And then what would you do different as a result? How would you farm differently? How would you eat differently? What different choices would you make? And then let's just say by some wild instance that this is all wrong, right? We're still fine. So it's
not going to hurt us to eat organic. Right.
But anyway, so tell me about this. I've applied glyphosate. I have handled glyphosate barehanded. I have spilled glyphosate on me. No effects yet. I'll just so, and even in eating, right? So here I am drinking coffee. Glyphosate's known to go to the seed deposition, the fruit of plants. So if the floor of this coffee orchard was sprayed with glyphosate, it's high probability there's glyphosate in this coffee right now in some trace amounts. We get it into us, and you said some of it's sequestered into our bones, okay, or into our bone marrow. How does it ever come out? How do you detoxify?
Right. I mean, it does come out. Of course, in the bone marrow, you have the stem cells, and the stem cells come out with tissue repair, and they carry glyphosate on their backs, and they deliver the glyphosate to the wound. So that's not a good way to heal the wound.
New area that's needed most.
Needs it most. It's got the glyphosate getting delivered to it. So that's not good at all. And it's, getting it out. Yes, I guess it's good to be practical about how to get it out, right? And I think there's been some studies on animals, like chickens and cows. In fact, there was a nice study on cows that I really appreciated, because these cows were sick. They tested, they had glyphosate, high levels of glyphosate in their urine, and they thought to treat them. I'm sure they had some prior knowledge about why this might be a good idea, but they treated them with bentonite clay, activated charcoal, fulvic acid, humic acid, and sauerkraut juice. So the sauerkraut juice was really quite interesting. And you may just think, oh yeah, of course, that's what you would do. But I was surprised. I wouldn't have thought of it. That's for sure.
I would have thought of the sauerkraut juice.
Yeah.
I would have maybe had a little more mineral supplementation. On plants, we use zinc a lot to help detox.
That's very interesting, because zinc is also, zinc deficiencies connected to COVID-19. People with zinc deficiency have a hard time getting over COVID. And there have been papers. I remember a paper that showed that rats exposed to glyphosate, if you sort of buffered up the zinc, you gave them a lot of zinc before you give them the glyphosate, that the effect of glyphosate on the liver was much milder. The zinc was protective against the glyphosate, which is interesting. And maybe just because you need to have more zinc in order to not get catastrophic results of glyphosate binding up all your zinc. I don't know, but with the additional zinc, it protected them from the glyphosate toxicity.
And in general, we have less zinc in our food or in our diet because we rarely historically haven't refertilized zinc. So as we remove it in the crop yield, we don't typically put it back on a field. Secondly, as our yields increase. So, our yields are 3 to 4x of what they were 40 years ago. But that yield typically is coming in the carbohydrate composition, not in the, on corn, for example, it's all in the starch, not so much in the fats and the oils. So it dilutes it out in our food a little bit more with the high yields. Yeah. But then, like you said, we've got the tie-up from glyphosate, and a lot of zinc comes from red meat. Which we're
told not to eat
for a long period of time. But
that's very interesting. It's just coming together of a number of different factors that could really be causing a systemic zinc deficiency. Another one, of course, that I'm very interested in is sulfur. And actually, I've read some stuff about using sulfur, supplementing sulfur for their fields, and sort of papers arguing that it might not be that useful because, again, when you look at yield and the amount of money it costs you to put the sulfur on there, that maybe it's okay if you don't. So in other words, that it's okay to have a sulfur deficient crop because you still get enough yield. I mean, you wonder whether the criteria that are being used to decide whether a crop is good or not are not really based on the nutritious value of the crop. And I think you're alluding to that idea.
Yeah, and we've recommended the application of sulfur for 25 years, and that was really before we had a massive drawdown from the soil and the Clean Air Act. But yeah, sulfur is everything to do with plant tissue disease resistance. So
yes.
you don't need to go ahead and be sulfur deficient, but there you have to spray our fungicide for disease resistance. So
there you go. And I think the same is true for the human. When you don't have enough sulfur, you are actually susceptible to yeast infection, for example.
Okay, so you heard it right here. Dr. Stephanie says, eat your onions.
Right.
Your other onions. You got to have the garlic in there and other salt.
Absolutely. They always make the food taste better, right? I love onions and garlic. We use huge numbers of them in our cooking in my household.
So, talk a little more about what do you wish, what do you wish farmers knew about glyphosate when they chose to apply that to their farms? Because, still today, 300 million acres are farmed conventionally, and
right.
almost every one of those acres receives glyphosate, probably at least 1 pound per year, if not 2 or 3 pounds per year. What do you wish they knew?
Well, I wish they would understand that glyphosate is toxic, and that their food, if they're producing food that's contaminated with glyphosate, that's not healthy food that they're selling, and they should feel worried about that. And of course, for their own safety as well, the exposure to glyphosate that they are not going to be able to avoid. Certainly, if they're going to use it, they better be very careful with how they use it. But I think they would be much better off not to use it at all. And of course, if they can produce an organic crop, they can sell it for more money per pound. So they might be able to, in terms of the cost, they might be able to offset the extra cost of having to deal with the weeds some other way through the increased value of the crop that they produce, and monetary value, but as well as, of course, health value, which is so important for the welfare of our nation, is to have healthy people in our population.
And at the same time, what do you wish consumers knew about glyphosate?
Well, the same thing, that glyphosate is all over the food supply, and that eating certified organic is a way to lower your risks significantly, not necessarily eliminate glyphosate altogether, because it's certainly showing up in some of the certified organic foods because it's in the rain, it's in the rainwater, it's in the air, it's in the rain, it's sort of probably in the manure if they're using manure for the crops. So you sort of, at this point, it's hard to avoid because it's so pervasive in the environment. But eating certified organic will definitely lower your exposure.
And it is in the manure, like you said. Plus, they've also, there's correlation to when there's high levels of phosphorus available, which manure has high levels of phosphorus, it desorbs the glyphosate from the solution, making it more available to the plant.
That's interesting.
That's
one thing that I read a recent paper that was quite fascinating to me, that it showed that when you put glyphosate into waterways, that the glyphosate actually gets sucked up by the biofilms. I don't know if you've heard this. It's quite amazing. This paper was really impressive. It was like 2 to 4 orders of magnitude higher concentrations of glyphosate in the biofilms than in the free water. It just got sucked up by the biofilms. And that's very, very worrisome for the animals, the small animals that live in those biofilms that are the base of the food chain.
Yeah, because it's just mistaken as phosphorus, right? And used as phosphorus in the...
Yeah, there's some reason why the biofilm is actively taking up the glyphosate. And so they're assuming that it's being dissipated, it's disappearing, but it's not. It's just going into the biofilm. So you can be misled about the amount of glyphosate that's in the waterway because it's all hiding in the biofilm.
Kim, you're going to have a very long list of links at the end of this podcast, I can tell. So, Stephanie, if you can get us the links to that paper,
I can get you a link to that paper.
We're certainly going to share this with our audience. So,
good, I'll do that.
People, look at it and see for yourselves. So, what's the alternative? If we don't have glyphosate, there's a lot of places that are highly erodible. Glyphosate really ushered in the no-till revolution, not having to till around to cause us to farm a lot more. I think, we built a system, a farming system around glyphosate. And I think when you ask a farmer, well, a farmer said, what am I going to do without it? Right? It's not just take this away.
Uh-huh.
You're asking him to change his whole approach, right?
Right.
What have you heard, or what are some things that you're aware of in that regard?
Yeah, well, I have been reading about the no-till, and that is quite interesting that you're able to pretty much hold nutrients in the soil by not sort of stirring it up, right? And glyphosate is essential to that no-till process, at least they think so. Do you have a way to do no-till without glyphosate?
Well, we've made a commitment to get rid of glyphosate, but we've probably gone to the next worst thing. So it's a matter of what's the least worst. Currently in our no-till system, we're using cover crops for that initial weed control, but we are chemically terminating those cover crops with
I see. That's
the next
bad.
chemistry that you'll hate, and that's paraquat. So,
oh gosh,
which is not
that's
great
not
at
good.
all. The interesting part about that is we don't have the persistent soil effects, right? Paraquat's here and gone, but
I see it.
No doubt.
It leaves more quickly, but it causes more toxicity when it's
Correct.
there.
But what we're trying to do is get to ways that we can limit this. So we have been discovering some companion cropping opportunities where when we have a cereal grain planted, and then in the spring we'll plant the soybeans into that. And the cereal grain, we let it grow to harvest, and no weed control is necessary. So we're currently doing that on about 20% of our soybean
That's
acres.
cool. That's really great.
I think there's little things like that we can do. And then the other thing is, why do we have to farm everything? I think there's D, E, and F slopes, really steep hillsides. We don't need to farm. I think we can graze those or permanent pasture or hay crop those and row crop the less slopes that we can till. See, so it just requires this massive change of thinking to make it happen.
Yes, I've heard a lot about
cheer us on, aren't you?
Yeah, I remember someone I talked to who talked about doing a cover crop in the off season and then mashing it down, not killing it, but mashing it down. And then you have a device that can puncture the seeds for the plants through the mesh. And then the cover crop actually stays there, and the plants come up and miraculously come up through the cover crop. Right. And then the cover crop is protecting from weeds because it's mashed down, but it forms like a barrier to the growth of the weeds. And you just sort of let the plant give it a path to get through, but leave the rest of it all mashed down. Have you tried things like that?
We have. We've done rolling, and the trick is, depending on where you're at, north to south, okay, the further north you get, the ability to let that crop get big enough to mash it down, where the mashing kills it, okay, gets later and later for the crop planting for cash to grow. Okay, so I'm right on that borderline. I have to wait until about the 1st of June for that to work, but that really hurts our yields. Now, an organic system, like you're saying, with higher value, we could probably justify that. In a conventional system like we currently are, we can't. Now, if you go just a couple hours drive south, that's more of a possibility.
I see. That's interesting.
The crop would get mature enough in the middle of May to be able to mash it down and plant. So great questions. Oh my gosh. I think you're really trying to stump me here today.
I'm eager to learn what you know, because you know a lot more about farming than I do.
You want to know more about the glyphosate, though. I said, I think what would you just to share with some people? Where are some places that you wouldn't expect to see glyphosate in our food that maybe you've run across in some of your studying that you've done and looking at this issue?
You mean which foods might have higher levels of glyphosate than you would expect? Yes, ma'am. That's a good one, because people know about GMO crops and they think, oh, non-GMO, that should be safe. And that's not true at all. So just to remind you, the GMO crops are the corn, the soy, the sugar beets, the canola, which is the canola oil, alfalfa, and cotton. Those are the main GMO Roundup ready crops where you can just spray the Roundup and the crop survives. But there's a lot of crops that are sprayed right before harvest with glyphosate as a desiccant to kill the crop intentionally, to synchronize the yield. Sometimes you're rushing against a frost, right, to get the yield before the frost sets in. So there are good motivations for doing that. But those foods are the ones that are ending up with the highest levels of glyphosate, and they're non-GMO. So non-GMO is not a good enough label if you're trying to avoid glyphosate. And that includes, particularly what I was surprised about was the garbanzo beans, chickpeas, all the legumes. They were coming up with the highest levels of glyphosate of any foods. This was a study done by Canada, the Canadian government. And it was a friend of mine, Tony Mitra, who has been an activist for a long time. He kept harassing them and saying, you need to test for glyphosate in the food. And they finally complied, and they tested glyphosate levels in thousands of different food samples. They looked at both Canadian grown foods and imports, from the US, from Europe, from Mexico. And it was an interesting story. He wrote a book called Poison Foods of North America, based on the data which they gave to him. And so that book is useful for finding out which foods have the highest levels, which ones you definitely don't want to order at the restaurant if it's not organic, that sort of thing. And I used to love hummus, and I used to really enjoy ordering hummus at a restaurant, but now I won't unless I know it's organic. So it's just that it's high enough in glyphosate, I don't want to go near it. So that's interesting, the chickpeas, but also oats. So the oat cereals and oatmeal cookies, oatmeal, these are things that kids eat a lot, and they've got very high levels of glyphosate. And of course, wheat is sprayed right before harvest. I think glyphosate is the primary reason for the epidemic we're seeing in celiac disease, which is a sensitivity to gluten. We've got so many people, we've just got huge sections of the grocery stores these days of gluten-free foods because so many people are sensitive to gluten. And I think that's a direct consequence of the glyphosate in the wheat. So oats and wheat and barley, and that means beer. Yeah. Beers and wines both have glyphosate in them, which is very sad. So you have to drink organic beer and wine. Organic beer can be hard to find sometimes. There's not very little of it around.
Yeah, and so is organic wine. And part of the reason I know on the wine process, you can't use sulfur dioxide to stop the fermentation. And that's not part of the organic protocol. It's almost you wish they could have a non-glyphosate wine, but still could use the
that's very interesting
standard protocol on it. But back to what you're saying, a desiccant. Okay, so a desiccant is a harvest aid and used more in the northern tier states or in the eastern states where we're trying to get the crop to finish quicker. Like you were saying, pre-frost, in Canada, be able to get it harvested before the snow flies. But in the eastern half of Kansas, for example, we get a lot of rain, and the wheat becomes very sensitive to fungal diseases, and it falls down. So that's a thing. But oats in particular, I think is very, very interesting because, oat milk now is
yes.
Oh, this is the next greatest thing. And, oats, we spray with, I don't, but I mean, they're sprayed with glyphosate to get them to dry down quicker because they like to down. And if
even after it's harvested?
Well, no, if you naturally let it dry, the plant will fall down and you can't harvest.
Yeah.
So they try to spray it, kill it quick so you can harvest more oats. And the trouble is it's translocating right to the seed right at that time.
It's very bad. Yes. Yeah. And that's so terrible because the popularity of oats with children.
It is. Yeah. And as far as oat milk being a good alternative, the best thing with there is probably to avoid it would be organic.
Absolutely. Yes.
So,
which is available, I think, increasingly available.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the things that have just really surprised you, shocked you on this journey that you've been on of discovery?
I guess the thing that shocks me the most is that people dismiss what I say, because to me, it seems so obvious that this is happening. And people always find another reason why, that, or to deny even that it's happening, like autism isn't really happening. It's just being diagnosed more. The denial is amazing to me. The inability for people to see the world the way I see it, because I just think it's very clear to me that there is a big problem here. And of course, I have all this evidence that I've been gathering for years at my disposal, but I don't share all of it with people. But it seems like I have to share really a lot of it before people become convinced. And some people never become convinced. They just think, and partly that's, I guess, because they've been told it's safe. The government says it's safe. It's been used for a long time. There's a sense of it can't possibly not be safe, given that backdrop, right? Mm-hmm. It's something that's very hard to believe when it goes so against your previous belief system. very hard to shift your perspective to believe that it is so toxic. And of course, because it happens slowly, you don't really notice it. You don't really realize you're being poisoned because you don't get that immediate effect that you do with some of these other chemicals, which fools people into thinking that it's safe.
Why do you, what have been some of the people that you have seen that switch flip, okay, where the evidence has finally gotten them to a point where they understand, or what does it take people to change their paradigm, essentially, in approach to glyphosate, or that you've seen?
I think one thing is just becoming sick, or even maybe deciding to go on an organic diet and having something go away. Some, for example, urinary tract infection. I definitely think that glyphosate is a causal factor in urinary tract infections, which are very common, especially among women. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, once I switched to an organic diet, I basically never got a urinary tract infection. It just went away. And there was someone who contacted me who was the husband of a woman who had a really serious problem. And I've forgotten what it was called. It had to do something with that kidneys and bladder condition that was much worse than a urinary tract infection. And she was struggling so much to deal with it. And when she went organic, the whole thing just disappeared. She had tried all kinds of different drugs and whatnot. Nothing was working. Went organic, it was gone. And then he wrote up about it in his on the web. He wrote a lovely article about her story. So it's, people, and people may be working with glyphosate and then getting symptoms of something that is associated with glyphosate. And that'll definitely, when it happens to them personally, that will definitely be a wake-up call. Like a farmer gets non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, right? He's all of a sudden convinced that maybe glyphosate wasn't such a good idea.
Yeah. The sad part about that is it's can't reverse it.
It's too late. Yeah, that's why you really need to be able to do it up front. You need to recognize the risk before it happens to you, and that's what's hard for people to do. People don't react to things if they don't see it, if they don't feel it personally. It's right. Only after they feel it personally that now it's too late, because it's gone so long that it's very hard to reverse.
Well, I think that the key is we don't want to wish anybody a health issue, right? Or
right.
Things, but we do wish that you would, listen, consider, read Stephanie's book, read some other articles that are out there and the links that we'll have in this podcast, but just strongly consider for yourself what the potential is for this. And, the other thing that I'm concerned with too is just, let's say we did stop today.
Yes.
We still have a legacy load that we're going to be dealing with for, 25 to 50 years.
Yes.
Within water and atmosphere, atmosphere won't take so long, but water and soil will be an issue. But
it certainly was surprising to me. Another paper that I read recently, this was a new paper in like 2020, 2021, looking at glyphosate residue in trees that had been sprayed with glyphosate 12 years before. And they found glyphosate still as a contaminant in the trees, in the tissues of the trees. And so it can last a really, really long time.
Yeah, it will continue to recycle throughout the tree. Really, for the tree's life, it'll slowly go down over time as it exudes out the roots and maybe reacts with some of the soil. But then you just run the risk of it being remineralized and taken back up into the tree again.
Right, it keeps on recycling. That's the thing.
I can spot it just because we have the opportunity to work with trees, but you can see the bud failure and the branch formation differences.
That's interesting.
With glyphosate, and Dicamba is the other one that's really, really spooky, that auxin inhibitor, and what that's going to do for long-term tree health. But that's another story.
I read about Dicamba and the rolling out of Dicamba Resistance. So you have a double resistance in the genetics of the GMO, both glyphosate and Dicamba. And then you have a product that has them mixed together, and you can give, because they are glyphosate resistant weeds. And actually those glyphosate resistant weeds are probably an increasing problem that's making glyphosate less attractive, right?
I think probably that's a great point. Unfortunately, I think glyphosate will go the way of just not effective before it goes to the way of not being.
It'll be that it's not effective. It's the cost effect.
Right.
Cost benefit ratio will go down because you have to use more to get to kill the weeds.
Especially this year when the prices doubled and sometimes tripled, and supplies are a problem, because not the active ingredient, but surfactant packages that go with it are on a a boat from China. So it's a
Interesting.
real problem.
So
In
the
the
price is
industry
going up,
at the moment.
and
Yeah.
that makes organic more attractive too, because
There you go.
yeah, that's interesting.
I
One
think
can hope that that will happen. Glyphosate will become not cost effective.
exactly. And I think it's just to back up a few minutes ago about you mentioned a friend with the UTI, urinary tract infection. You're really looking at a change of the biome going on that's causing that, because of its
Yes.
selectivity of probably gram positive versus gram negative microbes, and also for, in the soil, we see it be more anaerobic species selective. Aren't we really kind of changing our overall gut biome, which is changing our overall microbiome within our body that lends itself to more of these UTIs and those kind of things?
Absolutely. That's definitely going on. Of course, that's also the inflammatory gut and leaky gut, and all those issues are also being caused by glyphosate. The microbes, the bacteria that are more sensitive to glyphosate turn out to be the ones that are more beneficial. So you have the bifidobacteria and the lactobacillus, which are so important. In the child's gut, and then they get killed off by the glyphosate, and then things get imbalanced, and you get many more pathogenic species that are releasing toxic chemicals that are getting into the brain, actually, and affecting the brain. So there's been tremendous increase in the number of papers written recently about the gut microbiome. There's a tremendous increase in awareness that the gut microbiome matters, which I think is a direct consequence of the fact that it's not working. It's not working because of the glyphosate exposure. So we're much more aware. It used to be it just worked fine, so we didn't really think about it. We didn't study it. But now we're trying to figure out, which species are causing disease and which ones are good, which ones are bad, that sort of thing. Very, very complicated research space that they're doing these articles that your eyes glaze over, because there's so much data, about all these different bugs. I mean, it's just like everybody's gut is unique. It's very, very complicated.
It is. And then what happens when you put a biocide, within the diet, which glyphosate has been registered as a biocide. And like you said, many of these beneficial organisms, the LEBs and those kind of things are really affected. And I think it's, again, just the effect of unintended consequences, right?
Yes.
But so by not using them, those kind of things is certainly what you'd implore us to do. And then let's say people who are listening that want to detox, simply not having it in your diet is key one. Any other tips that you'd have for people as they look to live and drink and eat cleaner and try to work this out of their system?
Yes, well, I certainly support not just certified organic food, but also whole foods as opposed to processed foods. Very important to switch to a whole foods diet. Take the time to actually cook in the kitchen, go back to grandma's style of eating. And also eating sulfur. I told you, sulfur-rich foods. I'm a very big fan of sulfur. I think sulfur deficiency, and especially sulfate deficiency, is a systemic problem in our society. And I wrote about it in my book because I think glyphosate is disrupting many of the enzymes that are involved in managing sulfate, making it and transporting it and swapping it from one molecule to another. There's a whole bunch of enzymes involved in managing sulfate. And sulfate is super important for digesting, for your cells to be able to break down debris. They need sulfur and sulfate. And it's also important for maintaining healthy circulation. It's got many, many important roles, and people don't realize it's not something that's talked about very much by the industry or by the experts in health, in the health field. They're not as aware of more and more of them are becoming aware recently, but it's not been an obvious talk. For example, it doesn't have a minimum daily requirement. Sulfur does not have a minimum daily requirement. Yeah. But I think it's deficient in our diet, and glyphosate disrupts the enzymes that make it safe and make it effective. So a lot of people have sulfur sensitivity problems. So they don't like to eat garlic because it upsets their stomach. And I think that's because glyphosate's messing up critical enzymes that are involved in handling sulfur correctly.
Yep, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that before in regards to sulfur in the diet, but you're right. It's not included as one of the 17 essential things according to our government, and those kind of things. So definitely something to keep an eye on. So moving forward in the future here, what have you got your eye on? What are things that you're exploring right now, and other topics that are of interest to you in your ongoing research and study?
Well, a big one for me, a new one since 2019, is deuterium.
Oh.
You're laughing, but
you said 2019. I'm like, oh, here we go. We can go there too. That's fine. Deuterium, tell me about that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in deuterium. I happened to get approached by someone, Laszlo Boros, who's a Dr. Laszlo Boros, professor actually. He's a Hungarian born, and he was trained at the Szent Györgyi Institute in Hungary. And deuterium is something that Russia, Hungary, and Ukraine are the key countries that where research is going on with deuterium. And in the West, the doctors don't even probably know what deuterium is. So we're completely clueless about it. But it turns out to be super fascinating physics and biology and chemistry involved with deuterium. So deuterium is heavy hydrogen. It's an atom. Hydrogen, of course, is the smallest atom, 1 proton, 1 electron. Deuterium has 1 proton, 1 electron, and 1 neutron. So it's twice as heavy as hydrogen. It's naturally found everywhere in nature, something like 155 parts per million in seawater. And it's present in all of our food. So it's just basically everywhere. Our body has to deal with it. It has different physical properties from hydrogen because it's heavier. It tends to stick better in covalent bonds, but it doesn't do so well in ionic bonds. So it changes sort of the whole chemistry of how water works. When you've got deuterium in the water, deuterium water behaves very differently from regular water. And the really curious thing is that it's extremely toxic. So they figured out how to make deuterium-rich water back in the 1950s. And in the 1960s, they did some experiments where they exposed rats and mice to high deuterium, totally abnormally high deuterium water, which apparently tastes pretty much like water, looks pretty much like water. So it's a super good poison because it basically killed them within 10 days. It was extremely toxic. Now, of course, normally you would never see water with that much deuterium in it. But the fact is that the small amounts of deuterium that are in our water, in our food, matter tremendously to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria, the whole metabolic system is orchestrated around making sure that the water in the mitochondria is low in deuterium. There's all these fancy mechanisms that allow it to do that. And that's important because the deuterium wrecks the ATPase pumps that make ATP in the mitochondria. So you get mitochondrial dysfunction if your system is unable to maintain low deuterium in the water in the mitochondria. And it turns out that all these enzymes that are involved with that process are susceptible to glyphosate's mischief. So I'd already singled out these enzymes as being likely getting hit hard by glyphosate. And then I discovered that these enzymes are also involved in maintaining low deuterium in the mitochondria. That's what made me extremely interested when this person approached me and said, hey, you got to look at deuterium. So I, just like with glyphosate, I just started reading everything I could about deuterium as soon as I heard from him about that. And I became very convinced that one of the things that glyphosate does, and you might best characterize glyphosate toxicity as a disruption of that system that maintains low deuterium in the mitochondria. And the result of that is mitochondrial defects, which they release reactive oxygen species. They don't produce enough ATP, so the cell loses energy. It's got reactions causing damage to the cell tissue. So it's really, really bad if the cell's not able to keep deuterium low in the mitochondria.
So blocks its ability to reduce that, which would then cause, death ultimately to that cell, or zero energy production and essentially energy starvation of the cell from the mitochondria.
Yes, and many, many diseases are connected to mitochondrial dysfunction. You can find papers about linking mitochondrial dysfunction to a huge list of our chronic diseases. So I think it's key. And the mitochondria are so important, of course, because they provide the energy, and they can cause toxic exposures by virtue of their release of superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, these sort of not nasty oxidizing agents that get released when they're not working properly. That's the thing, that the deuterium causes them to, first of all, not be able to make enough ATP, but at the same time to be spewing out these reactive oxygen species. Two really bad things go wrong in that context.
Which then those oxidative species, that's, free radicals. And,
exactly.
And cancerous causing
yes.
agents. So this podcast is going to have to include a flow chart on your thinking too. Here, how all this works together. I'm following along, but I'm look calm here above the desk, but my feet are just trying to run to keep up with you underneath. So.
It's fun stuff.
Is that a spatial distribution problem? In other words, result of byproduct of manufacturing primarily, or is that an environmental, ubiquitous problem on deuterium?
Yeah, it's around in our environment all everywhere. It's not like you can avoid it, and it's actually, I think, a natural part of biology. Biology has figured out how to exploit deuterium, and what it actually does is, I'm really fascinated with the whole way the biological systems handle deuterium, because what they do is they trap the deuterium in gelled water, and the gelled water is made by all these sulfates. So the sulfates is distributing along the blood vessels, gel the water that lines the vessel, and trap deuterium in the gel. And so when you trap deuterium in the gel, what's left behind in the fluid blood is low deuterium water. You're sucking out the deuterium and trapping it in the gel, and then you've got low deuterium in what's left over. And then you have these enzymes also that are able to only work on if it's hydrogen. So it's quite fascinating. There's these lipids, fatty acids. You can make fatty acids, and people have done that. The pharmaceutical industry has made fatty acids that have lots of deuterium in them. And they're thinking that they might be actually beneficial because there's an enzyme called lipoxygenase that actually reacts with the fatty acids and produces a product that's inflammatory. So their thinking is, if we can have people eat fats that are loaded up on deuterium, then that enzyme won't work. And that will be good because it will stop inflammation. That's the logic that they use. They're completely broken, because the fact is that those fats have very low deuterium. So eating a high fat diet is eating a low deuterium diet. They naturally have low deuterium because the enzymes that make the fats know how to avoid deuterium. And so fats become a healthy food. The mitochondria love fats. They really prefer to metabolize fats for that reason, because they already start with low deuterium. So, but this lipoxygenase is actually producing deuterium depleted water, which is so essential for the health of the mitochondria. And when you block it, you can't make that deuterium depleted water. People are going to get sick. So what people don't realize, they say, oh, inflammation is behind all disease, but inflammation is what makes deuterium depleted water. And so because your natural systems that could do it without inflammation are broken, you have to use this backup system of lipoxygenase, which produces deuterium depleted water, but at the same time, it causes an inflammatory response. So it's quite interesting. The yin and yang of all of this, lots of times you have a health condition that causes pain, but in that pain is something that's happening that's helping you to solve your bigger problem, which is like your mitochondrial disruption. So I think a lot of these diseases that are associated with pain, like the pain in the joint, it's actually in the joint making deuterium depleted water and helping to solve that problem for the mitochondria. It's really interesting.
It is fascinating. What other topics are on your radar right now?
COVID-19.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What in regards to COVID-19, what are some of the things that you're concerned about?
Well, I'm concerned about glyphosate because I think that glyphosate is a major player in causing severe disease with COVID-19. And in fact, in my book, I wrote a whole chapter on glyphosate and the immune system. Glyphosate, I think, does a real number on the innate immune system. It really disturbs it so that you don't have natural immunity. You don't have adequate amounts of natural immunity, which means that you're more susceptible to infections. And so in particular, the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus is better able to proliferate in a person's lungs if that person has been exposed to lots of glyphosate. And one thing I'm particularly interested in there is the possibility that there's a new problem in recent years with biofuels. And biofuels are, these fuels that are derived from biomass, which often, for example, you would, and you may know more about this than I do, but my understanding is you grow a field, for example, of wheat, you harvest the wheat, and then you take the stubble and you throw it on a barge, you take it to a plant and turn it into biofuel. And you can convert these, remains of the crops after you've harvested. You can convert them into, ethanol and methane gas and biodiesel, even home heating oil, all these different biofuels that can come out of this biomass. And it's a way to reduce oil consumption. So that feels like a good thing, with respect to climate change. But the problem is, I think that the glyphosate's ending up in the biofuel, and then it's evaporating into the air and ending up in the nanoparticles in the air in cities where there's a lot of trucks and cars and buses driving, bioethanol or diesel fuel. These vehicles are causing glyphosate to accumulate in the air, and then people are breathing it. And so when you breathe it in, you've got your lungs getting exposed to glyphosate that's disrupting their ability to fight off the virus.
Because the beneficial, is it because the beneficial microbial associations or colonies that would exist within your nasal passages and such are altered? Or is it because of, that the immune system cell response at that surface?
Yeah, it's probably some of both, but I think particularly if the mitochondria are damaged, then the immune cells don't get enough energy to do their job. They can't do their job, but it's more than the mitochondria. And in my book, I talked about surfactant proteins. There's a whole class of proteins called collectins, quite fascinating. And these proteins have a collagen-like stalk, and the collagen-like stalk looks like collagen. And collagen is the most common protein in the body. 25% of our proteins are collagen molecules. That's the glue that holds us together. Collagen has a long sequence of GXY, where every third amino acid is a glycine. It's the most glycine-rich protein in the body. Tremendous opportunities for glyphosate to substitute for glycine. And when the glyphosate substitutes, it disrupts the triple helix structure that collagen not naturally forms. And what this is going to do for those surfactants is to prevent them from getting out of the cell. The cell makes the surfactants and they're messed up because of the collagen, because of the glyphosate in the collagen. And then they can't be released into the surfactants, the surfactant proteins, which would normally trap viruses. So they can't trap the viruses. The viruses get a chance to just infect the cells. They have a field day. so I think it's, many different, many different proteins involved in the innate immune system are disrupted by glyphosate.
Fascinating. Well, I really appreciate your time today and everything that we've talked about. What you're looking into in the future is pretty amazing. And most of our biofuel crops, ethanol production is the largest biofuel. 90+% of it is a Roundup tolerant crop that is likely, and a almost equivalent percent is applied with glyphosate to it. So aerosolizing it, I hadn't thought of that before. So you got my mind, my wheels turning here. So we're going to be in touch, I'm sure, for a follow-up on this. And I'm so excited that you could be here and share some of your, the real future forward looking things that you're working with, Stephanie. It's truly remarkable. And I know at the moment you probably get a lot of ridicule, but 10 or 20 years from now, it'd be like, oh yeah. Yeah.
I hope so. I hope
Everybody knows
eventually.
that, right?
Yeah, I really hope eventually people will, really try it on for size, really dig into the research and see if I make sense, because I think, from what I've read, it makes a lot of sense what I'm finding. So.
Any final thoughts before we part ways here today?
I do want to mention sunlight because I'm a big fan of sunlight. Getting out in the sunlight without sunscreen, without sunglasses, pick up that vitamin D. It's very important, again, against protection against COVID, because they've shown people who have severe disease almost always have a vitamin D deficiency associated with that.
Mm-hmm. That is true. And if you live too far north, it means you should go to the south, take a vacation and get some.
Exactly. That could be your excuse to go down to Florida and have a good old time.
Medical reason. It's deductible,
medical
right?
reason. Yes, for your health.
Well, I appreciate that. thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate all the leadership that you're showing and helping people discover a better way to do things.
Thank you. Yes, it's been great. Enjoy talking to you.
Yep. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this conversation today. Sometimes our topics are hard, but necessary to hear. Hopefully, we've encouraged you to do some critical thinking of your own about our production systems and how we can continue to work to improve not only soil health, but human health as well. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing to help growers implement soil health practices, check out our website at asn.farm, and there you can click on links to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. There's a lot of great things happening and always something to learn. Thanks so much for listening.